Joining me here today is Jacob Mitchell, who's the Deputy Chief Investment Officer, Platinum Asset Management. And we're talking about Asia. Now, you guys have publicly said that you think Asia is a fantastic investment opportunity. Can you talk us through some of the reasons why and perhaps give us a couple of examples? And I know Asia is a big place, so it's all-encompassing.
So you want me to say something more than it's big, it's growing, it's interesting. I'll do my best, Mark, to answer the question, but what we're observing in some of these larger economies like China, for instance, is that there is now an acknowledgement that from the leadership that we've got to move beyond this sort of credit and infrastructure intensive growth model, and the leadership is sort of enacting some reforms. I mean, on one hand, the corruption crackdown could be seen as being just the leadership cementing its position, but we also believe it is about trying to improve the governance and control over the provinces. And the attitude that any GDP growth was good growth is now starting to change. So basically putting in place incentives, admittedly some of them are quite negative, that if you're not going to meet the standards when it comes to pollution abatement, if you're going to approve projects that have that are only stack up on the basis of heavily subsidised energy inputs, or the inappropriate pricing of pollution, then you're going to fail your qualitative scorecard, and that may have consequences for your career as a bureaucrat. So we think that's quite sensible reform, and it really is just it's a part of China's modernisation. So we think that's interesting, but what's probably more exciting is just the fact that you can buy good quality companies in China at attractive valuations.
Because you were really saying that a lot of investors have really just thrown their hands up in horror, for want of a better word, with China, and just walked away that it's all too hard.
I think that's it's not just China, but it's probably the same thing could be said about Korea, and to a certain extent, it really, Japan was in that same group only 2 years ago. I mean, it was just all too hard. These companies are uninvestable, and I think what's more interesting as an investor is to sort of understand, well, each of these countries or jurisdictions has their institutional bias, and it doesn't matter if it's the US or Germany, China. They all have an institutional bias. Now, sometimes it can be an unhelpful bias, but they also have the ability to remake themselves and reset their course, as we've seen in Japan. And so when we look at China, I mean, we're being very selective. I mean, we want to be buying companies that we think can grow in spite of the macro. Our long history of investing in Japan, where the stock market has really gone nowhere for 10 years.
They've had a 20-year recession over there, essentially, haven't they?
Yeah, and the macro has been poor for most of that 20 years. Has really been an experience of finding the companies that are growing and where you can buy them at a decent entry-level valuation. And that is our philosophy anywhere in the world.
I mean, you made a lot of money out of Toyota out of Japan, just because Japan wasn't a great place to necessarily have economic activity. They sold a lot of Toyotas elsewhere, didn't they? So.
Yeah, well, funny you should say that, because it's a global company just listed in Tokyo.
Yeah.
And you could say Samsung, in Korea.
In Korea,
it's a global company, just so happens to be listed in Seoul. We often you just see that some of these, what we would call leadership companies, or companies with a interesting franchise, where Toyota it's one of the few automakers that's achieved any sort of scale in hybrids, and it has a platform that's profitable. It gives them a clear competitive advantage. In the case of Samsung, it's so cheap now, and we know why the market's negative. It's issues around what the ultimate profitability of their phone business, where they're getting competition from cheap white box makers that coming out of China,
Yep.
and the sustainability of those profits. But this is a deep technology company with leadership positions in display technology, logic chips. Not to mention the fact that the memory business is making a lot of money, and we're confident that they have a strategy they've executed in the past in the same way that Toyota came back.
Yes.
After people had written it off, we think and there's other examples of these sorts of franchise stocks, and
just while we're talking about Korea, it's your interest goes beyond just the manufacturers like Samsung.
Absolutely, yeah.
Into the consumer, and I didn't realise that Korea had such a large population. I think over 40-50 million people.
Yeah, look.
Can you spend just a couple of?
Yeah, we are. I mean, South Korea is, we think, interesting at a lot of different levels. I mean, so it's the current account surplus is running at about 5% GDP.
Yeah.
So they've really eaten the Japanese lunch in a lot of areas, and they're almost victims of their success now. And they're aware of the dangers of ultimately being, following the Japanese down that model where you end up in a deflationary spiral. You get the strong currency, which reinforces deflation in the economy, and people defer consumption. And it's really a story about the economy being too heavily weighted towards manufacturing and exports, and the household sector size being small relative to the wealth of the nation.
Right.
The Japanese kind of got stuck in that trap, and now they're looking for a way out.
Yeah.
And I think the South Korean policymakers are looking at that, and they're starting to respond.
Right.
They're saying, okay, we need to stimulate the household sector. So the policies that are being enacted now are around, cutting the requirement for a 50% down payment before you get a mortgage.
Yep.
It sounds from coming from a Western Anglo-Saxon tradition, that sounds quite draconian.
Yes, indeed.
And again, off the back of the global financial crisis when people were financing at 95%.
That's true.
But some of these North Asian economies, have really discriminated against their household sector in favour of a mercantilist, export-led model.
Yes.
Interesting thing is that's starting to change, and that's
where the opportunity.
And that's where the opportunity is. So you can buy the key mortgage banks like KB Financial in Korea, are trading at a little more than 0.6 of book,
which is about 20% of the value of Commonwealth Bank, I think, here, just ballparkish.
Yeah, and property price. The other sorts of reforms that are taking place is just putting incentives in place for better corporate governance amongst these leading companies that are tending to hoard their cash rather than pay it out in terms of dividends.
Yeah.
And also pension reform, and so I think Korea is moving in the right direction. And what we like most about it is, though, that stocks are cheap and people are relatively down on the identity of Korea. And China's it's a different story. I mean, it's obviously much earlier in its economic development, but there's lots of interesting opportunities there as well, I think. Yeah.
Look, thanks very much for your insights, Jacob, into that area. We could talk all day on this stuff, but there's just a couple of tidbits for to find out more.
Excellent. Cheers. Thanks, Mark.